The MCAT is hard and the MCAT's important. I know we've heard that ad way too many times. I know I have. But in all seriousness, I was able to get a 94th percentile on the MCAT. And if you don't believe me, my score is right here. And I was not only able to get that, but I jumped from a 55th percentile all the way up to that percentile, which is a pretty crazy 14-point jump. To make that kind of jump, I had to make very drastic changes in my study strategy. I spent way too much time studying for the MCAT via trial and error, and I want to share with you guys the things I did to succeed. First thing, in order to really understand how I was able to improve on the MCAT, I want to go over what I did wrong when studying for that test the first time. When it came to taking my 503 attempt, the first thing I did wrong was I actually planned very poorly. And what I mean by that is that the MCAT is a test meant for you to get into medical school. And I didn't think 2 or 3 steps ahead when taking the MCAT. I took my 503 test in May 20th, 2021. At the time, the MCAT application opened on May 31st. So I thought to myself,
oh yeah, I could take the test and then I could take 1 week to write my essays and then apply to medical school.
However, I grossly underestimated the amount of time it would take to write my primary personal statement. Second off, I wouldn't get my score until a month later, so I couldn't even compile a realistic school list until I got my score back. So people were already going to turn in their applications while I was still thinking of what school to apply to. It was very poor planning if I wanted to submit my applications very early, which I highly suggest you do because you want to give yourself as much of an edge when it comes to applying to medical school. And the reason why I go so much into depth into this is because the MCAT is a tool ultimately to get into medical school. Even if you have a great MCAT score, you may not be able to get into your top choice if you apply later. Whereas some people who have lower MCAT scores can have more of an advantage if they apply early in the cycle. So my huge blunder with my first attempt was that I took it way too late. I didn't take it with anticipation in mind. I should have taken it in March or April. At the very last day, April, because that right then, I would have gotten my score back in May and I could have designed a school list that was realistic to my MCAT score. My second mistake was that I focused way too much on content. And what I mean by that was that I only focused on memorizing the content and not so much applying it. Because the MCAT is a test that requires you to apply the content. I noticed that there were many questions I was missing that in which I knew the content behind it, but I didn't know how to properly apply it, and I was missing a ton of points because of that. A huge mistake that I made with those questions was that I simply went back to the book and reread the content, which didn't help at all because I was missing the application of the content, which actually comes from studying how the MCAT functions as a standardized test, rather than going over the kidney for the 57th time. My third mistake was that for my first 503 attempt, I pushed my test back way too many times. I was thinking of taking the exam during 2020, which fortunately then at the time, the AAMC lifted all rescheduling fees so I could reschedule my test for free. Now, with that, I got way too comfortable pushing back my test 4, 5, and even 6 times. When you push your test back too much, you start to get too comfortable studying, and that leads into my fourth mistake, which was that I got way too comfortable studying via passive learning methods. Even though I did passages, when I reviewed them, it was through passive learning. I only read the explanations and just moved on to the next one. I think when it comes to improving on the MCAT, you need to actively review your mistakes. That is definitely what I did in my second attempt. By passively reviewing my mistakes in my 503 attempt, I wasn't able to take proper accountability for my own mistakes and I wasn't able to improve from them, which is ultimately what you need to do on the exam. When it came to me scoring my 517, a huge thing that I did to improve was that I focused my studying around the question stem and the passages. I focused more on improving on the actual exam rather than the content behind it. Even though there were some pieces of content I didn't know, I started improving when I started doing more passages every day. And not only doing more passages, but also reviewing them in detail. I made a review sheet called a Why I Missed It sheet, or as one of my good study buddies calls it, an LLJ, Lessons Learned Journal. And those sheets really helped me take proper accountability for my mistakes, and I would often start to see patterns in what I missed. Those patterns are crucial for you to improve on the MCAT. Even though I did say in my first attempt I only focused on content, I did still study content my second time around, but I studied content with context. I'll say that again, content with context. I only studied content after I missed a question. because when I missed a question, I would have even more context with which I could approach the content information I needed to understand. And I found that to be extremely helpful. I often came up with these Chinese proverb-like sayings that I would repeatedly say to myself when I was studying the second time around, and I think that really helped. Another phrase that I started using was that I needed to stop thinking of the MCAT as a test that was trying to screw me over, and as a test that's really trying to help you get the question right. Because another huge thing I did to improve on my 517 attempt was that I focused on the question stem. Ultimately, nothing else really matters if you don't address the question stem. And I started seeing that the test tricked people because they picked answers that were true, but they're not able to see if it addresses the question stem fully or not. And that's a trick that the MCAT uses quite a bit. They'll put answers that are true, but that don't even answer the question. So I started to slow down when I read the question stem and highlight certain key words, especially in Psych Soc. If you highlight certain key words, you may only need 1 to 2 words to get the entire question right, which is something I'll go over when I talk about each section in more detail. But ultimately, I started focusing and slowing down on the question stem, and that really helped me. And I started seeing that when it came to passage-based reading, the question stem helped me look for the right information in the passage. For example, in a physics passage, they may talk about what is the electric field of said cathode. And then the passage in paragraph 2 would mention said cathode. So the question stem would lead me to the right evidence, and I could use the right evidence to decipher, okay, how do I get the right answer out of that? And that would come from either a formula I knew in Chem Phys or another piece of critical thinking I needed to undergo in order to get the answer right. The moral of the story was that I started to see that the MCAT was more like a stepwise process to get the right answer, rather than a test that was trying to confuse me. And I think ultimately that was a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy saying I would say to myself, and I started to improve after that. My third huge win that I did when it came to my 517 was I planned my test a lot better. I meant to take it in January, but I ended up taking it in March of 2022. Regardless though, March of 2022 was still a very good time to take the exam, because after I got my score back in April, a month later after the exam, I was able to be very pleasantly surprised with my improvement, and I was able to plan out a school list because originally I wasn't entirely sure if I would do that great on the exam, and I was thinking of applying to schools that were lower than what I got in my actual score. However, when I realized I got my 517 back, I realized that I could shoot for top programs. I would highly suggest you take the MCAT at least a month before you decide to apply to medical school, because that way you'll get your score back and you could come up with the school list based off of that. And I think that is extremely powerful when it comes to admissions, because admissions really weighs your MCAT into consideration in order to get your foot into the door when it comes to medical school. You still need to pass interviews, but the MCAT will definitely be a factor behind to which you may get an interview invite. My fourth huge win when it came to my MCAT studying was that I got a study buddy. And this was really huge because study buddies engage me more in active learning. I had one study buddy in particular who I found on Facebook, and even though she lived on the other side of the country, she was extremely helpful in helping me understand the MCAT and improve on it even more. When you have a study buddy who's able to explain a wrong answer that you may not entirely understand, that tends to be a lot more powerful than just simply reading the explanation. Oftentimes I found myself getting very tired of reading explanations straight off my computer. I'd be like, oh, my eyes with her, I don't feel like reading it, it's too much reading, I don't want to figure this out. Rather, I think it's more powerful if it comes from somebody verbally, which is why I think a study buddy really helped. And another third benefit that comes with study buddies is that it gave me a teaching opportunity. There were times where she missed questions that I got right, so it gave me a chance to further reinforce the information I knew and to explain it to her. And even when we both got questions wrong, it was a huge teaching and learning opportunity for the both of us, because we would put our heads together and try to figure out, okay, why is it that we got this question wrong? And we would both come out learning even more than we would have had we each gone over the question alone. I know I'm probably going to get questions on this, so I want to tell you guys what resources I ended up using. This isn't a straightforward answer because my resources ended up changing from my first attempt to the second attempt. So I'll tell you why I used the first attempt. First attempt, I ended up taking a Kaplan course live online, and that course provided me with the 4 AAMC exams, as well as the about 2,000 questions for the AAMC QBank. I also got provided around 3,000 QBank questions for Kaplan. Don't quote me on these numbers, I don't entirely remember them, but that's the rough estimate to which I think is right. And I was also provided with 10 practice exams. So it was a total of like 14 tests and then about 5,000 questions, including both Kaplan and AMC, because the double AMC came with the Kaplan resources. Another resource I ended up using was UWorld, which is about a 2,000 question Q bank, which I think is a really good resource. I think it costs around like $250, but I will say that their explanations are very high quality, and it's definitely something that I would highly recommend you do with the study buddy in case you don't understand their explanations. Even though, like I say, they are really good. Another huge resource I think is really good that lots of people tend to miss out on is Jack Weston. I really love Jack Weston because it's free and they have bottomless passages. The people at Jack Weston release 3 MCAT passages every single day. They do one science passage, they do one passage that's called fundamentals, which are like 10 discrete questions that quiz you on your content knowledge. I think it's very good for ensuring you know the content for the MCAT. And they have one cars passage, which I think is something great you should practice every single day, because cars, it's very much a you either use it or you lose it type of section, where I think daily practice is extremely helpful. And given my car score improvement from my 503 to my 517, I would definitely say that doing passages every day really helped me. And Jack Weston was a huge factor behind to why my car score ended up improving. It wasn't entirely fabulous on my 517, but it ended up improving to a decent score. Another resource I also used was Anki, and I found that extremely helpful when it came to memorizing certain chemistry physics formulas, as well as some psych-soc concepts. Now, I did find myself cheating on Anki in the sense that I would spam my spacebar in order to just be done with the cards, and I don't think that's a good way to use Anki. You need to use Anki as an active study tool. Don't just press the spacebar or whatever it is you do to get to the next card just because you want to get it done. I think that's a bad mindset to have with Anki. So as a matter of fact, I stopped using Anki for my second attempt because I found that reviewing my passages was a more effective use of my time. Now, when it comes to the resources I used for my second attempt, I only used Jack Weston, the AAMC, and UWorld. Those 3, and that was it. And the reason why I used those 3 resources was because I wanted to streamline my studying down to passages. And I wasn't too focused on content at the moment. I was focused on how to improve when it came to doing better on the MCAT passage-wise. A mistake I made when doing my first attempt was that I used way too many resources that made me a bit more unfocused. I felt the need to finish all of them rather than to do them at a quality level and to review them with quality. The first time around, I reviewed them with the objective of getting as much done as I could, rather than trying to actually learn from the review process. I think that's where a lot of MCAT students need to be a little bit careful, because your review process is everything when it comes to improving on the exam. It's not a wise idea to rush it at all. I do have tips for every single section on the exam. When it comes to Chem Phys, it is my strongest section on the exam. I ended up getting a 99th percentile when I took it for my 517 attempt. So I have a pretty good idea of how to do well in this section particularly. My first step when it comes to Chem Phys is to have the formulas memorized like the back of your hand. You need to come up with mnemonics in order to memorize certain formulas. Mnemonics are going to help you out massively. And I came up with a little review sheet that I had in which I wrote down every single mnemonic I knew. As a matter of fact, I would love to share it with you all. If I can get 15 likes on this video. If I get that many likes, I'll share my sheet happily and for free. I'll find a way to link it down below in the description. It was a sheet that I personally used in order to get such a high score on Chem Phys. Now, another tip I used in Chem Phys was I skimmed the passages. The passages tend to be very short in Chem Phys. Not all of them, but a good portion of them. So you could get away without reading them too much into detail. And this is where another one of my Chinese proverb-like sayings comes in. This saying is that I'm not going to worry about it until a question tells me to do so. I would tell myself that every time I was attacking Chem Phys, and that helped me out quite a bit because I saw that the passage was really moot in that it didn't really help until you read the question, because ultimately the exam is centered around getting questions right. And it turned out that many passages in Chem Phys contain quite a bit of fluff that you don't need. Oftentimes, the question stem will only require 2 numbers in order to get the question right. For example, if they ask about electric field, you will only need the values of voltage and distance. That's happened to me many times throughout my practice on the MCAT. So in Chem Phys, I often found myself having a little bit of extra time in the end. Not that much though, I would allocate that time to the more difficult passages in which I did have to read in more detail. Stuff like optics, fluid dynamics, very tricky concepts. And when it comes to improving in Chem Phys, in order to score a 99th percentile, you will eventually have to start worrying about low yield content, like fluid dynamics and optics as an example. Content that you may not have been taught in undergrad, because my undergrad physics course only covered electricity and magnetism, but there was a whole other array of physics I needed to know. So I had to actually teach myself that via getting questions wrong and learning why the answer is right. So in Chem Phys, you'll need to master difficult concepts like fluid dynamics, Bernoulli's principle, buoyancy, optics, light, sound. Chem Phys is the section that really encompasses the phrase, it's a mile wide and an inch deep, because you could really be tested in anything when it comes to physics, Gen Chem, OChem, Biochem. Even some bio may show up on that section. So when it comes to Chem Phys, know how to get good at sifting out information that is useful to the question stem in the passage. I think that was something that really helped me out in Chem Phys, was that I found it the easiest to get the right information out of the passage. And I guess I'm a little biased towards it because I do like chemistry and physics a lot. So having a passion for those subjects may help you out on the exam as well. Now, when it comes to cars, I want to say I do not think I am the most qualified person when it comes to giving advice on cars, given that I got a 126 on my second attempt, which is a 72nd percentile. It's a decent percentile, but it's not a highly achieving percentile. I would feel a lot more comfortable about the advice I have to give about cars, how they scored a 130. That said though, I did go from a 122 to a 126. So for those of you who are extremely struggling in cars, my tips would be to practice cars passages every single day. Because for me, cars was very much a section, like I mentioned before, a section where if I didn't do it every day, I would start forgetting my strategy and I would get worse if I didn't practice cars every day. With my strategy, I was a slow reader, so I had to hurry myself up when it came to cars passages. I would highly suggest leaving a minute per question when it comes to cars. Cars is a very interesting section of the MCAT because it's the one section where you don't need any background information and it's strictly reliant upon your passage interpretation and critical thinking skills. So when it comes to cars, you get a 90-minute time frame in cars to do 9 passages. So 10 minutes per passage, roughly. I would suggest doing 10 minutes per passage when it's 6 questions. You could do 10.5 when it's 7. And then I would suggest doing 9.5 minutes when it's 5 questions. But when it comes to cars, I would highly suggest allocating whatever amount of time you need in order to fit a minute per question. For example, if I got a passage that's 6 questions long, I would only take 4 minutes to read the passage, 4 minutes or less. That way I would have 6 minutes for the 6 questions I need to answer in cars. Likewise, if a passage is 7 questions long, I would only take 3 minutes or less to read the passage. That's something I highly suggest if you're struggling in cars, because ultimately the principle of not worrying about the passage until the question tells you to do so is the same when it comes to cars. And you need to give yourself ample time to think about how to answer the question and to practice proper process of elimination when it comes to crossing out wrong answer choices. And that takes time, which is why I suggest leaving a minute per question, because that's a good amount of time to answer a question. My tip when it comes to biochem is to get good at reading figures. I would argue that biochem is a section of the exam that has the toughest figures. You will need to have an understanding of p-values, given that a p-value of less than 0.05 means that it's statistically significantly different. These p-values are going to be represented as asterisks. Get good at differentiating graphs that have asterisks and graphs that do not have asterisks. My rule is that if there's 2 bars and one of them has an asterisk, the one that has an asterisk is different than the one that doesn't. Now, if you have another graph that has 2 bars and they don't have an asterisk, even though they're at different heights and they don't have an asterisk, they're the same. Asterisks will tell you if 2 different sets of data are different or not. And I think once you understand that rule, it will really help you out massively in biochem. Other than that, my advice is very similar to Chem Phys, is to get good at sifting through information in the passage. But I mentioned the figures because biochem has the most hard to interpret figures on the exam, which is why I often hear of my clients who I tutor who are bio majors who did very well in college, but they find themselves frustrated they didn't get a 99th percentile in the section. And that's because the figures often hold them back. When it comes to Psych Soc, it's one of the easiest sections to improve in on the exam because I have had dozens of clients who I've tutored study Anki and they've shot their scores up to a 128. And for some reason, I see a lot of them getting stuck at that range, 128, 129, which is a good score to have on that section. But if you want to break 130 and get above that, you're going to have to start interpreting the passage better as well. There's a reason why they call Psych Soc CARS 2.0, because a lot of Psych Soc is reliant on you making conclusions and reading the passages pretty well. So it requires you to read the question stem very carefully and to use the question stem to go back to the passage. I know my advice when it comes to each section in particular is roughly the same, in the sense that regardless of which section you're on, you need to read the question carefully and ensure you address it, because that's how you improve on the MCAT. And another thing in common with all of these sections is that you need to do your review sheets. I personally wrote out Excel sheets on Google for every single wrong answer I missed. I didn't do ones for the ones I guessed because I didn't think that was an effective use of my time. And my philosophy was that, okay, if I guessed on it, I'll get it wrong the next time and I'll review it then. I was a bit lazy when it came to doing my review sheets, but I would argue that this laziness led to efficientness without having to do extra work reviewing answers I guessed for whatever reason. Now, when it comes to reviewing your answers, you need to start seeing patterns in why you're missing things. For me personally in CARS, I saw that I missed things because I couldn't find the right evidence. And it was because I wasn't paying careful attention to the question stem. Hence, I needed to slow down when it came to the question stem. Even though there are students who do well in undergrad, they often do poorly on the MCAT because the MCAT is not really a good test to measure how well you did in undergrad. The MCAT is a test that measures how well you do on the MCAT, as obvious as it is to say. And I say that because ultimately, you need to learn how the MCAT works. It's not going to help you out if you just simply study all the content you knew in undergrad, and even do practice questions from undergrad. You need to understand how the MCAT is going to test your critical thinking. These are the tips I wanted to give when it comes to making a 14-point improvement, because ultimately, that was how I was able to make that huge jump. To recap, the thing you need to do the most on the MCAT is to focus on passages. But not just the passage, because a passage is just a tool to help you get the question right. People talk about focusing on the passage on the MCAT, but I rarely hear advice about focusing on the question stem. So my closing advice is to focus on the question stem and to highlight certain parts of it. Because if you have a trained eye that can look at the question stem carefully, it'll lead you to the right information in the passage. And the right information in the passage will give you a leeway to start thinking about what is the right answer. And I think that is crucial to improving on the MCAT. My second closing note would be to take accountability for your own mistakes. It's very tough to look at ourselves and be like, yup, I screwed up. That's a very tough skill to have. And that's something you need to get good at when studying for the MCAT exam, which is why I recommend typing out review sheets, if not writing them out. Either or is very helpful, and that was something I did religiously. I really hope that this video will help you guys. And even though it's a longer one, it was a lot of advice that I wanted to get off my chest, because this journey was something that was a huge struggle for me for a very long time. And it was the first time I was able to get good at a standardized test. I did all right when I took the SAT. I believe I got like 70 something percentile, I don't remember. It was a decent percentile, but it wasn't anything to write home about, which is why I was shocked when I got a 517 on my MCAT, which is 94th percentile. And it's been helping me massively when it came to medical school admissions. And I've been getting interviews so far, which I think has been very promising. Don't want to talk about interviews yet until the whole process is over, but once I do, I'll make a video on that. In the meantime, I hope these tips have helped you all, and let me know if they end up working for you. In the meantime, take care.